What I'm going to be doing in this session is laying out some of the conceptual thinking, which, as I said, is always ongoing in the STEP Centre, about what we think about sustainability, and particularly this thing that we call the pathways approach. Well, what are some of the sustainability challenges that we're facing? All of you have talked about this in terms of your own backgrounds, but we are seeing an unprecedented context for rapid environmental change, complex dynamics across multiple scales, claims of interlocking crises, sometimes framed as a perfect storm or the nexus of food, water, energy, disease, and so on, and set within a wider debate about whether we are hitting or superseding thresholds or what other people have called planetary boundaries. And there's a huge amount of public, scientific, policy concern about these questions today. And that's why the work of the STEP Centre is really squarely within broader policy debates globally. A lot of the discussion is around what role can science contribute to all of this, and how do different policy and public concerns enter this debate. And a lot of our concern is about how those debates become politicized, become framed in what Sheila Jasanoff called a new climate for society, or indeed a new climate for social science. But what of that society, and what of that social context for these environmental debates? Our world is more than ever one of mobility and interconnection, these old categories of north and south, developed and underdeveloped, no longer apply, but where there are very fundamental shifting economic and political landscapes and deep-rooted inequalities that are affecting the way different people can respond to environmental and sustainability challenges. And this suggests a shifting geography both of power and of privilege, and social relationships that are structuring the way the politics of sustainability is played out. So this is the terrain into which the STEP Centre's work enters. And we pose, rather broadly, a general question. How can pathways to sustainability that link technology and environmental integrity with social justice be conceptualized and indeed built in this complex and dynamic world? We are interested in connecting political debates, environmental debates, social debates, and economic debates in the context of this fast-changing world. And we've evolved what we've called this pathways approach in different ways over time, as it were, as a guide to thinking and action. We apply an interdisciplinary and an engaged approach, bringing together development studies with science and technology studies, and bringing together, at least in Sussex, two institutions, the Institute of Development Studies and the Science Policy Research Unit, together with perspectives from our variety of partner institutions and our emerging hubs in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where different conceptualizations, different understandings of sustainability rooted in different contexts are emerging. And we debate these across a variety of domains of food and agriculture, health and disease, water and sanitation, energy and climate. And we bring health and sustainability into our debates. So in the rest of this presentation, I want to outline the various elements of what we think and this is, as I say, emerging thinking, always changing, what we think the core elements of the STEPS pathways approach are, and how this conceptual work links to some of the debates that we're having within our empirical projects, and how in turn this links outwards to how we link thinking with action. The Dynamic Sustainabilities book that many of you have seen is our attempt of a few years ago now to try and crystallize this. And in a way we try and address a number of ongoing contradictions within the way these debates are discussed. Because although there is a growing recognition amongst many people of complexity, of dynamism, of intercoupled social, ecological, technological systems, of non-linear, cross-scale dynamics and uncertainties, and although there is a growing recognition of diverse knowledges and ways of knowing and values, perspectives, priorities, there's also, in many quarters, and you will all know this, a growing search for actually quite top-down, restrictive, technical and managerial solutions, which are premised on a much more static, consensual view of the world, that there are solvable problems, achievable stability, controllable risks. And that's, in a sense, the tension and the contradiction that we have been addressing throughout in the STEP Centre between these dimensions. There's a mismatch. So as more and more attempts are tried to impose that static, control-orientated set of solutions, there are cycles of failure. The dynamics, of course, always undermine these assumptions of stability. There are backlashes from nature, from politics, from people. There are disagreements, particularly disagreements and challenges from those who are on the margins, who are not necessarily benefiting from this control-orientated managerialism that so often is portrayed as a solution to sustainability challenges. So then what are some of the building blocks of this pathways approach? Let's start with, in a sense, the core term, sustainability. This, of course, has had a long history. It dates back, of course, to, in environmental context, to debates about the management of forests in the 18th century in Europe. But it only came into vision in policy debates in the 1980s, when it became much wider currency and central to debates, for example, around the limits to growth, 1970s debate that preceded the planetary boundaries discussions of today, and of course most particularly in the commission chaired by Gro Harlem Brundtland that created the landmark report Our Common Future in 1987, which defined and has been a sustained definition ever since sustainable development, linking environment with development. And as you all know, from the 1980s onwards, and particularly in the build-up to the first Rio conference in 1992, there was a huge debate about how to connect these different debates, and it became very much part and parcel of international policy discourse. And of course, in this year, as we move towards the agreement of Sustainable Development Goals later this year, sustainable development has yet once again risen to the top of the international agenda. But one of the reflections that we've had, as well as many others, is that with the rise of sustainability in core global policy debates, there has been a reimposition of sometimes fairly simplistic managerialism that have been labelled sustainable development. And while many targets have been proposed, conventions agreed, very often the underlying debate about the contested politics of sustainability has been left aside. Some have said, well, let's just get rid of this term, sustainability and sustainable development. It doesn't really add to our debates. We would disagree with that in the STEP Centre, but we would argue very strongly that in order to re-energise a momentum around sustainability and sustainable development, we need to inject a new politics of sustainability. And there really are, we think, some clear opportunities to insert into research, into policy discourse, and into practice new ways of thinking. And that's what, in a sense, the Pathways approach is about. And this requires sustainability to shed some of its managerial pretensions and become recognised as what it always, in a sense, was, as a political term. And go beyond its colloquial usage of sustainability simply being capable of being maintained at a certain rate or level, inherently conservative and not very dynamic, to something more dynamic and more political. And we also need to go beyond that Brundtland definition. Debates about sustainability where in the Brundtland Commission the argument was very much debates about sustainability should be normative, but there was, in a sense, an implicit assumption that this was consensual. But actually we go further and argue that actually there are often multiple views, multiple normative contested views about sustainability, and that there are inevitably multiple sustainabilities, which need to be defined really quite precisely for particular issues and groups, relating to particular properties, particular flows of goods and services, and the goals that they value. Sustainability much more as a contested terrain of politics. So thus, amidst, for example, climate change and related drought, sustainability of farming and seed systems needs to be defined in terms of national food security or the livelihoods of poorer dryland farmers, or in relation to gender justice and the related questions of who has access to which crop varieties and which farming futures. Different ways of understanding sustainability depending on who you are. So the rhetorical appeals in policy to sustainability can be, and often are, used to actually obscure these contested interpretations and interests around particular versions of what we mean by sustainability. So we need to dig below the surface, dig beneath the rhetoric and uncover these interpretations. And that is actually a really key task for research and activism. And in this way, sustainability becomes this contested, discursive resource, facilitating argument about diverse options, diverse pathways and different futures, bringing sustainability firmly into the realm of the political, where debates about justice, about democracy, about citizenship have been for centuries. So how do we conceptualize all of this? Well, we start from a perspective that recognizes that the world, and that's what this squiggly diagram over to the right there suggests, is endlessly complex and highly dynamic. And it's useful for analytical and practical purposes to think in terms of systems, and I'll explain how we think about systems in a moment. Systems as combined social, ecological, technological components and elements interacting in dynamic ways in particular environments. Now, systems, of course, are constituted not just by the material elements, but they're constituted through diverse people's agency and practice, but also the concrete materiality and wider structures that allow them to emerge. And it's this classic tension, writ large, right across the social sciences, between agency and structure, between practice and wider processes, always relational, always dialectic. That's absolutely the heart of this sort of analysis. And that's how we take systems to be understood. In many ways, it's actually very similar, if you go back in time, to what Karl Marx called classical political economy method. Those of you who've read the Grundrisse, his treatise on method in political economy, will remember that he talks about the multiple determinations of livelihoods and practices intersecting with what he calls the concrete, the structural, material features that condition and shape what can happen. And so in our terms, shape what pathways of change emerge. And this means that we can go beyond what Marx called the chaotic totality, all of that on the right, to understandings and interpretations that carry with them a politics, and not just a description of endless complexity. But central to our understanding of systems, and actually not very prevalent in classical discussions of political economy, is an attention to the politics of knowledge. This crucially adds another dimension, a reflexive dimension, drawing on methodological constructivism in the social sciences. And that's to recognize that there are multiple ways of understanding and representing the system, or the systems. And it's the interaction between practice and structure are always embedded in negotiations of knowledge and meaning. And that means that all analysis of a system, of policies, of practices, of institutions, involves what we would call framing. And framing involves not just choices about which elements in this complexity to highlight and how to bound the system, at what scale, but also subjective and value judgments. In other words, again, politics. Such framings are produced by particular actors, whether different local people, scientists, policymakers, business actors, all co-constituted with their particular institutional, political, and life course settings. And so it's this iteration, this iterative way of understanding pathways, and with them understandings of sustainability, that we understand how notions of sustainability are constructed politically. Another key term that is important to understand in the way that we're thinking about sustainability is the term narratives. Particular system framing often become part and parcel of narratives about either problem or issue. And following the work of Emery Rowe and many others, we can understand narratives really as simple stories, with beginnings defining the problem, middles elaborating the consequences of that, and ends outlining the solutions. And narratives often start with a particular framing of a system and its dynamics, and suggest particular ways in which these should develop or transform to bring about a particular set of outcomes. Narratives, through that process, in other words, construct pathways. And I'll give you some examples of how we can think about that, and John and Lila will do so later. But we also have to understand how narratives are constructed. And narratives are often constructed through particular practices of science, particular practices of policy, particular practices of citizen action. And many of these practices involve the creation of narratives. They involve value judgments about what and who is included and excluded, what issues, questions, and solutions are prioritized, who's to blame and who should be amending their ways, labeling of particular people as culprits or those responsible. That's all part and parcel of the process of creating narratives. And understanding that is absolutely key if we're to understand how pathways to sustainability, or indeed unsustainability, are constructed by whom, with whose interests in mind. Let me just give you two or three little examples of how narratives and pathways interlock with each other, which can be elaborated on later. Here are two pictures, both from Western Kenya, both elaborating visually in these terms a particular contrasting narrative about what to do about agriculture in this setting. So on the left hand is, as it were, the classic, let's call it the Green Revolution narrative that says that massive boosts in agricultural productivity, improved plant breeding and genetic engineering have to be the basis for improving national food security. So you can see, framed around particular solutions, around a problem that's cast as national food security. The right-hand picture illustrates, from a similar region, the mixed farming setting within which most farmers are living. And here an alternative narrative might emerge around how food insecurities are very much locally based, very much constituted in households and the social relationships that exist in villages and between households, shaped by local ecological, social, institutional contexts, and actually, although elements of this may be useful, a more complex pathway involving socio-technical solutions based on different forms of knowledge may be relevant. Two contrasting narratives, and one could have a whole array of them in between, each suggesting particular pathways of change based on different understandings of sustainability. Here's another example highlighted in a recent policy brief produced by the STEP Centre in collaboration with our colleagues at JNU in Delhi, which has been on the back of a long period of research on urban waste management in urban India. And here, two different narratives about what to do with growing waste problems in a rapidly urbanizing and expanding urbanizing setting. One, this recycling approach for generating energy, an industrial, technical solution to waste management. The other, based on community-based organization around waste pickers to manage waste in a more integrated way at a community level. Two contrasting narratives, and again, with a whole array in between, suggesting different pathways to address the sustainability challenge. Here are two pictures related to work emerging out of our health domain, for example, looking at how to respond to epidemics, particularly epidemics from zoonotic diseases. On the left, film poster, very much associated with what one might call an outbreak narrative. Outbreaks emerging in different parts of the world are threatening humanity. They need to be controlled through effective, centralized surveillance, large-scale rollout of technological solutions. Very much a narrative we've seen in certain contexts recently. The right-hand picture is a picture from Bangladesh where palm tappers had been exposed to a particular type of virus, Henipavirus, but had discovered how and why to manage their system so that bat urine didn't get into the palm wine. An example of how to respond to the particular social and ecological context of disease, to respond to that in a particularly focused way, responding to what some people call a One Health approach. What I want you to do is hold in your minds the idea that narratives embedded in particular institutional, political contexts construct narratives and narratives about sustainability, and that there isn't just one pathway to that, to sustainability. There are multiple ones, always contested. So how do we then conceptualize that in terms of understanding strategies and dynamics towards sustainability? One of the issues we highlight in the Pathways approach, and core to STEP's interest, is how questions of system dynamics, and I introduced the notion of systems, our political notion of systems, are treated under different narratives. So as in the examples I've just said, narratives about action aiming to promote sustainability involve assumptions about the nature or temporalities of change, Are these seen as short-term shocks or long-term stresses? And are the styles of action that are envisaged control-orientated or more responsive? Is the aim to control the causes of drivers of change or respond to them? So taking that epidemics example, an outbreak narrative is very much the idea that there is a shock, outbreak, and control-orientated responses are what's needed. Whereas the Bangladeshi response to Nipah virus was very much more in a longer-term stress-orientated effect of disease and a more responsive mode. So by thinking about the relationship between temporality of change and style of action, we can ask, within any given narrative, are intervention strategies aimed at exercising control in order to resist shocks, i.e. the top left-hand corner, stability, aiming for stability, or is there an acknowledgement that there may be limits to this control, and thus intervention should resist shocks in a more responsive manner? And that's how we define, in this framework, resilience. In other circumstances, the system may be subject to important stresses, driving long-term shifts. In this case, interventions might be embracing both the limits to control and an openness to enduring shifts, and that would suggest focusing on robustness in the bottom right. We also might be interested in durability, where the attempt is to control the potential changes. We use this really just as a simple heuristic for thinking and for unpacking what we mean by sustainability, because we think there are some really quite important practical distinctions of where you are within this space. And perhaps you can think about the type of issues that you're confronting as to where conventional policy puts the issue that you're dealing with, and perhaps local people or others might think about the same questions. So let's just return very briefly to the case of epidemics, because unpacking these different elements helps us to think about, well, what type of things one would do if you're aiming for these different options. Different properties suggest very different strategies. And this is the case with dealing with an epidemic. One can see narratives clustering around each of these four quadrants in different ways. But as you'll all know, and as I've hinted already, there is quite a dominant discourse in public health and epidemic response that focuses in on the top left, stamping out short-term disease shocks in order to return to the status quo. The assumption that this is an epidemic disease rather than necessarily an endemic process. So we've seen in the last year, of course, these type of responses to Ebola in West Africa, and before that to avian and swine flu in different parts of the world, and SARS as well. These have all involved rapid response, containment, public health measures to limit contact and spread. And they've been quite successful in certain instances. But how thinking about a sustainable disease response system over wider areas and longer time frames, a more flexible response network that can be mobilized may be needed. And this has been a big debate following the Ebola outbreak. Many of the failures were that we didn't respond in that flexible way, and we didn't build resilience into health systems in ways that allowed robustness and durability and resilience to emerge and a more sustainable health response to result. And I think it's the argument in work about epidemic diseases, just as it is in any other area, that in this context we have to think about all four quadrants at the same time. And in some respects that's what a One Health approach tries to do. Now, sustainability then is the combination of all four of these in our analysis. All four properties are seen as necessary elements of sustainability. Stability is important, so we don't want to knock that. Durability is significant. Resilience is important, as is robustness. And if we're to manage the process of sustainability and think about what pathways might deliver it, we have to think about the trade-offs between these different properties and how policy goals and objectives can meet them. But analysis of sustainability is more than just a technical assessment of these properties of stability, durability, resilience, and robustness. We also must ask, what's the system we're talking about? Going back to those earlier questions of framing, what are its purposes? What are its functions? What are its meanings? What is to be sustained and for whom? Resilience and robustness of what exactly? And who in turn is to define each of these elements? All these aspects inevitably are highly contested. And that's what brings us to our understanding of pathways. So let me just reiterate what I've said in a slightly different way by what we mean by pathways. So as I've tried to illustrate, for any issue we might identify a whole array of different narratives. And in those photographs I've given you sort of ideal types of two, but there may be many more. And for each narrative we must ask a number of fairly simple questions. Who are the actors? How is the system and its goals for change framed by them? And what dynamic properties and strategies for dealing with them are prioritized? So some narratives justify and become interlocked with very powerful actors, and they become powerful pathways where particular directions of change over time are locked in. These are the motorways in our panoply of different pathways, if you like. But then there are also alternative narratives, much smaller paths, more subaltern, if you like, hidden, excluded from the mainstream, that are also there. The work of research and activists is to uncover these alternatives and confront the mainstream, or at least challenge the mainstream, so that we can get a more open and more democratic debate about what alternative pathways are appropriate. So constructing pathways to sustainability requires recognition of them, identifying them, deliberation amongst the different narratives that underpin them, and a wider debate about what possible pathways there are. And all of this has to be understood in the context of the wider governance arrangements. Narratives about change don't exist in the absence of wider politics and institutions. So central to our pathways approach, both an understanding of how narratives and pathways actually unfold in the world and seeking to influence those directions of change, is central. And this brings us to a very fundamental concern with governance. And by this we mean, very broadly, the political and institutional processes, including power and knowledge, that underpin how certain pathways are dominant and others are not. So governance processes that shape which pathways come to dominate and which remain marginal are really key in any of our analysis. And governance pressures often promote and maintain, as I said, particular lock-in to particular pathways, excluding alternatives. So a powerful narrative associated with powerful institutions and a particular type of politics can exclude alternatives. And in essence, this is what we've been discussing in our work on sustainability transformations. But what we have tried to look at is how particular types of narratives about change come about. And we have a very simple categorization here between different pathways of transformation. Some are very much centered on Big Bang technological solutions. Geoengineering and climate change perhaps is a sort of classic example. But there are others about how particular technological interventions might result in sustainability transformations. Others are focused on the creation and shaping of markets, getting the prices right, being very much part and parcel of how sustainability transformation should come about. I'm thinking here of carbon trading or payment for ecosystem services and a whole panoply of different market-orientated approaches that have become important in certain quarters. There are also state-led steering and financing that goes on. I'm not necessarily thinking of classic old-style state planning, but financing by development banks, by financing of R&D processes that allow transformations to happen. And one can think of much of the evolution of low-carbon technologies globally in this light, particularly in the context of financing in parts of Europe and now more recently and particularly in China. And we can think about transformations emerging from the bottom up, from citizen-led effort, through grassroots movements, through recasting of the nature of transformation. We can think of examples of the agroecology movement or transition towns and so on. And what we did in that book there and in the other debates that we've been having within the centre is look at a whole variety of different sustainability transitions. Transitions to low carbon energy pathways, transitions to sustainable agriculture, transitions to sustainable urbanisation. And ask what combinations in what context of these four archetypes, if you like, of forms and drivers of transformation occurred. And through the examples in that book, and you will know many others, we can see that it's often combinations of these, often in different sequences over often quite long periods of time, that can become important in the way that transformations to sustainability occur. And what combinations matter depends massively on the historical, political economy context of different settings. All of these are emerging now in the context of a globalized form of capitalism, but the role of citizens, of states, of markets, and of technologies is very different in different parts of the world. But all of them, wherever they are, whether it's in a more state-orientated form of transformation in China or a more market-orientated approach in the United States, for example, all of them involve politics and political contestations about what pathway is appropriate and how that's played out. So yet again, governance questions become crucial. Accountability, forms of democracy, the nature of deliberation are all crucial in what directions of change, what forms of pathways emerge, and what types of sustainability transformation occur, or indeed don't. One of the other things that we see very much in the review of all of these experiences, and I'm sure you've got your own examples, is that there are a huge array of different political and institutional factors that act to close down both the narratives but also the direction of pathways of change. There's a politics of path dependence, a politics of lock-in that occurs. And we've given some examples and discussed some examples already where the default in policy and in policy thinking is towards a control-orientated strategy towards stability. That's the managerialism that a lot of sustainable development got itself into and actually forgets these other elements of sustainability. And why is this? Often the answer, it's power. Power and politics which pushes the dynamics and the framing of the challenge and the solutions to that top left-hand corner. And it's towards that focus on stability where the problem and possible solutions come to be seen as a way of controlling shocks to maintain a stable situation where there is a whole array of different reasons why that dynamic occurs. And here are some of them. We needn't go through them all, but there are a range of institutional, political, economic pressures involved in the push towards that top left-hand corner, a push towards a control-orientated, stability-orientated, managerial set of solutions that actually undermine sustainability in many cases rather than promote it. Perhaps most fundamentally, these power dynamics inevitably encourage and enable incumbent institutions to pursue strategies that maintain the status quo. And as we all know, the status quo is unsustainable. So a focus on planned equilibrium, emphasizing stability, also relates to actually quite deep-rooted styles of cultural thinking, particularly in the West. An idea that about balance between human and nature relations as the normal, desirable state, rather than accepting dynamism and change. Yet it's in the ways in which ideas and discourses about stability and equilibrium become cemented into bureaucratic, administrative, institutional practices, procedures and routines that makes them so sticky, and why transformations to sustainability are so challenging, despite the fact that we know that it's an imperative for all of humanity. Such ideas in turn can acquire powerful political economic backing. Power of incumbency is very high. And in the case of many examples, whether we're talking about epidemics and disease control, or low carbon transitions, or sustainable agriculture, or sustainable urbanization, we see that the role of particular understandings embedded in the disciplines that we often come from emphasize stability and continuity. And the social sciences and economics and indeed many social sciences haven't been very good at dealing with this. We tend to be stuck in an equilibrium view of the world without understanding dynamism. And another element is that there is a sense that rather than seeking a more deliberated politics of transition and transformation to sustainability, we're always dealing with the drama that the media often plays out as powerful narratives of dramatic change, rather than seeking incremental processes of transformation. And the last point there is an important point about how we, policy people, practitioners on the ground, are often controlled through the forms of disciplining that Foucault would call governmentality and the way subjectivities are created, that we become disciplined into thinking that there's a certain inevitability of this kind of understanding and response. So all of these factors reinforce that move to the top left-hand corner. But what we argue in the STEP Centre, from this perennial process of closing down, narrowing down, and moving towards managerialism and stability, we need to open up. Sustainability challenges need to have this openness both of thinking and practice. We need to move beyond these singular views. We need to move beyond this framing constrained by our institutions, our disciplines, our experience and histories. And we need to challenge that by opening up in at least several ways, both challenging dominant narratives and pathways, but also opening up alternatives. And that we see as absolutely at the core of both the STEP Centre's intellectual challenge, but also our practical challenge as we work towards change on the ground. So, all of this leads to a framing of sustainability centered and rooted in an understanding of politics. Thinking and acting about opening up. We've been experimenting with a variety of different perspectives on governance, drawing on deliberative and reflexive governance approach. We think there are some really key roles for methods to break out of our disciplinary constraints, for opening up our ways of understanding the world and acting in it, new approaches for appraisal new approaches for methodological challenge. But also politics of sustainability involves some practical political engagement. And we've been particularly involved in thinking about how to influence policy processes in order to open things up, and how to reconceptualize the way we understand systems and dynamics to include a more nonlinear dynamic perspective that involves a variety of discourses, actors and interests. And in thinking about this scope for citizen action engagement, we have, there's a variety of kinds of different contexts, from very micro movements to broader networks to push for change. And that's, I think, central to our understanding of sustainability transformations, as I mentioned before. And within the centre, we also are engaged with relaying all of this in a wider debate, to have this broader conversation about what it means in different contexts to think about pathways for change. So I want to just conclude now by reflecting on how we understand sustainability in the politics of knowledge making. As researchers, as activists, as policymakers, as people who perhaps combine all three of those hats in our lives, we're interested in thinking about how knowledge can reach different types of audience. And this is really important to think about in terms of how we position ourselves as a centre. We're based at a university, but we're also linked through our networks to a variety of actions, both nearby and much further afield through our partnerships. So what kinds of knowledge making are important and who are they for? How should environmental social science or environment development work orientate itself amidst the wider practices of knowledge making and communication? At the heart of the STEPS approach, as I mentioned before, is this commitment to interdisciplinarity across the natural and social sciences, but also within the social sciences. And for any given area of science or social science, I think this, again, 2x2 little matrix here, drawn from a speech made by the sociologist Michael Burroway a decade ago, who distinguishes 4 different types of knowledge making, which he calls different types of social science or sociology. And for our purposes, we might think of different types of environmental social science. And each of these suggests a different way that we do this. As researchers in universities, and certainly as PhD students, we're often pushed, again into the top left-hand corner, towards producing instrumental knowledge for academic audiences. There's nothing wrong with this. This is professionalized knowledge, which is useful for the broader generation of debate in and amongst our disciplines and professions. But actually, Burroway argues that there are 3 other types of knowledge making that are also important. One is where we try and translate our professionalized knowledge, detailed understandings of a particular context and place, into policy. And we do that a lot in the STEPS Centre and try and relate with policymakers, involving policymakers right from the beginning in our research. There's also a debate that is important about extending our quite instrumental knowledge to more reflexive critical knowledge within our own domain, within academic audiences. And this is very much part of the STEPS Centre's perspective on our cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, critical perspective, to open up debate, challenge those assumptions that exist very often within our disciplines and within our policy fields, and open up a critical social science. The 4th quadrant, which is how to move reflexive knowledge, critical knowledge out from that debate within academia to broader, what Burroway calls public social science, or public sociology, is another ambition of the STEPS Centre, to generate debate around these critical issues that are of interest to wider publics, and to generate it in a debate in ways that is not necessarily constrained by the technical or disciplinary language when we would talk to our own colleagues in academia, but can relate out through the media, through public engagement of different sorts, to a public debate about these issues. And we believe in the STEP Centre that we need to do all four of those. Now, not everybody can do all four of those all the time. And that's why we work as a group, with different people doing things at different places, at different times, at different stages in their career. But my sense is, from hearing a little bit about your own life courses to date, is that all of you are, and this would be typical of people who come to the STEPS summer school, are moving between these spheres. Because we are all committed to change. We all have, as it were, normative political underpinnings of the work we do. They may be very diverse politics, but they're there nevertheless. We're all committed to really solid, rigorous research, informed by theory, informed by empirics, and we're interested, as our careers develop, in doing all of these together. And I hope that as we go through the summer school, we can discuss your own experiences and our experiences of how we combine these. These are often not easy to combine, and you're trading off career imperatives, university requirements with your own broader commitment. But I think understanding the politics of knowledge making, those of us who are training to be and indeed are researchers, is a really key facet and something that we talk about a lot within the centre. So, let me conclude. We're continuing to develop, elaborate, take forward, challenge, adapt elements of this pathways approach. This will always be work in progress. You may have the book Dynamic Sustainabilities in front of you, but you can be sure if we rewrote that today, it would look very different. If we rewrote it next year, it will look different again. That's why we really invite the conversation, we invite the challenge, we invite the difficult questions during the summer school. And our understandings of these debates is massively enhanced by the hub partners that are emerging in the consortium that we're launching, the STEPS Global Consortium, but also the interactions we have with students, with summer school participants, and all our research partners. So these are debates we want to kick off now within the summer school. So join that debate, challenge, question, extend, reframe, open up in the spirit of the STEPS Centre, because the pathways approach is most definitely not a recipe. But hopefully I've offered you some of the ingredients which I hope will be of use to you as we reconstruct this debate together over the next 2 weeks.